Hello, thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with Dona Flor and Her Two Husbands by Jorge Amado. This book was originally published back in 1966 in Brazil, and it was translated from the Portuguese by Harriet de Onís. Dona Flor and Her Two Husbands by Jorge Amado. I decided to read this because I watched a movie adaptation of this several years ago, and it was so much fun. I thought it would be interesting to read, so I put it on my reading list, and it's just sort of been hanging out there ever since. So I decided this year I was going to get this read finally, and I'm so glad I did because it was such a fun story. So this is one of those books, I'm going to be careful not to give away anything that I think would detract from a first-time reader's experience with the book, but this is one of those books that's not so much spoiler-driven. It's not so much what the story is, but how it's told. That's so fun. You know, Dona Flor, as the novel starts out, she's a young woman. Her mother, she has this overbearing mother. She has a sister and a brother. Her father has passed away. Her mother has pinned all her hopes on her children to have some sort of status in society, right? To marry well and have good sort of status in society. And the first daughter marries a mechanic. That didn't work out. The other one of the daughters, and then the son can't make it through medical school, if I remember right. So he's also rather a disappointment. So her mother ends up pinning all her hopes on Flor. So Flor, though, as you know, our children will often do, falls in love with someone that, her mother had actually her mother at first really liked. This guy's name was Virginio, and he presented himself as this really successful person from a well-connected family, but in reality, he was quite an interesting fellow. He was a pretty bad husband. He was a gambler. He was not faithful to her. He stayed out all night, all of this kind of thing. Ultimately, he passes away at Carnival right at the beginning of the novel, and she's left a widow, so she spends some time in mourning, missing Virginio. When she had him, he seemed to be nothing but trouble for her, but then whenever he's gone, she misses him. Well, then she eventually remarries to quite a different man, but then eventually the ghost of Virginio shows up, and then Dona Flor has her two husbands. She has the ghost of her first husband, who shows up naked, by the way, because when she's remembering her husband before the ghost shows up, she's remembering how he was laid out, getting prepared for the funeral. Whenever he was getting dressed for his funeral, and he was naked, and she was remembering at that time, sort of their life they had, their physical life. This book is pretty frank about its sexuality. It's Dona Flor's life with Virginio. He's exciting. He's a creature of physical pleasure. Her second husband is a stable man, very nice man, very sedate man. So quite different. He's the type of man she thought she wanted all along. But anyway, so this book is basically a matter of that kind of balance. And that's not giving anything away. That information is actually in the blurb on Amazon if you were to go and buy this book. But what I thought we would do is the way this book is written is really interesting. It's kind of Dickens-esque. So it's kind of like a Charles Dickens, maybe like, a Brazilian from Bahia, the specific region in sort of the northeast of Brazil, heavily influenced by African culture. In this region, but it's set in this city there, in this neighborhood. So there's this cast of characters. There are tons of characters in this book, and they're all really fleshed out. The language is very, very descriptive, and I'm going to read an example of that here in a bit that just shows kind of the way the book is written, and and it's sort of a difference in how that book's written versus this book is written versus how some of our modern books, I think contemporary literary books are, the goal is to be really sparse with the sentences, to be very, minimalist with what we're saying. This is not the case with Dona Flor and her two husbands. Very, very descriptive. I thought what we would do though is, just go there's 5 different parts in the book. So the book kind of kicks off with this title page, and I'll show it here. It says, Dona Flor and her two husbands, this strange and moving account of the experiences of Dona Flor, Professor Emeritus of the culinary art, and her two husbands, the first known as Virginio, the second, Dr. Teodoro Merueda, by name, pharmacist by profession, or The Fearsome Battle Between Spirit and Matter, narrated by Jorge Amado, public scrivener located in the Rio Vermelho quarter of the city of Salvador da Bahia de Todos os Santos, in the neighborhood of Largo de Santa Ana, where Iemanjá, Our Lady of the Waters, resides. So that sentence is sort of typical of the way this book is written. Then we have part 1, which is called The Death of Virginio, the first husband of Dona Flor, his wake and burial, to the guitar accompaniment of the incomparable Carlinhos Mascarenhas. So then we have part 2, which is called Of Her Early Widowhood, a Period of Trial, of Deep Mourning, with the memories of hopes and disappointments of courtship and marriage, of the wedded life of Virginio and Dona Flor, with chips and dice and the sad, now hopeless wait, and the annoying presence of Dona Rosilda, that's Dona Flor's mother, with Edgar Coco at the violin, Cami at the guitar, and Dr. Walter de Silveira with his magic flute. Then part 3 is of the period of half mourning, of the private life of the widow in her retirement, and the sleeplessness of a young and bereaved woman, and of how she came, upright and gentle, to her second marriage, when the weight of her dead husband bowed her shoulders down, with Dona Dinara at her crystal ball. Dona Dinara is one of the neighbor women who tells fortunes. Very funny. Part 4 is called Of Dona Flor's Life, orderly and peaceful, without fears or sorrows, in the world of pharmacology and amateur musicians, glowing in the drawing rooms, and the chorus of neighbors reminding her of her happiness, with Dr. Teodoro Merueda in a bassoon solo. This is her second husband, who is a pharmacist. He owns a pharmacy. He plays the bassoon in an amateur orchestra. The joys of his life are going to the pharmacology associations, local meetings, and debating different papers and aspects about pharmacology, and playing in this amateur orchestra. So quite a different life with him than she had with sort of the scoundrel Virginio. Then part 5 is called Of the Terrible Battle Between the Spirit and Matter, with Unique Happenings and Astounding Circumstances which can happen only in the city of Bahia, and let him who will believe the tale. To a chorus of drums and bells, with Eshu singing a mocking song. I had closed the door, I have now ordered it to open. Eshu is one of these gods that's sort of a folk god that rules Virginio's ghost, basically. So that's the different parts. I mentioned about sort of the language that's used, and there's a quote I wanted to read about that because it really describes how Portuguese is such a descriptive language. It's such a beautiful language, actually, and how that is how the experience of reading this book in translation would be for an English speaker. So here is the quote I'm going to pull out and read. This is actually at the Mass for Virginio after his death. And the quote says, At the Mass of the 7th day after Virginio's death, at which Dom Clemente Negra officiated in the Church of St. Teresa, the beautiful nave enveloped in the bluish transparent light coming from the sea across from it, as though the church were a boat on the point of weighing anchor. The sympathy and the solidarity manifested in whispered comments were addressed to Dona Flor, kneeling in the first row before the altar, all in black, wearing a black lace mantilla lent her by Dona Norma, one of her friends, which hid her hair and her tears, a rosary between her fingers. Ladies and gentlemen, that was one sentence. One very descriptive sentence. So that's the experience of reading this book, is these sort of descriptions of people, places, things, food, very descriptive, very colorful, very just vibrant, and, just such a pleasure. There's a further quote that says, "The whispers did not express pity because she had lost her husband, but rather because she had had him. Bent low, Dona Flor heard nothing, as though there were nobody else in the shrine, only she, the priest, and the absence of Virginio." So the whispering at his mass, the mass in memory of him, was how lucky she was that he had died, because he was such a bad husband. But she, on the other hand, is in very deep mourning. There's another quote that I want to read, though, before I run out of time, because it was another sort of fun thing. There are tons of these little funny, interesting sort of looks at life and what it means, to be alive and to have a community, to have people around you with all these different sort of personalities. But this quote I think is very cool too. It says, "Who is going to take the trouble to bear glad tidings? For that there is no hurry or impatience. Nobody goes running into the street for that. Only when there is bad news. To carry that, there is no shortage of messengers. There are those who are willing to make the greatest sacrifices, give up their work, interrupt their rest, sacrificing themselves completely to bring bad news." What a delightful treat. Yeah, gossip, when there's a good juicy piece of gossip, people run into the street with that, but, good news spreads usually a little bit slower. So I thought that was really funny. There's lots of this. There's multiple characters. There's one American character that I think is really funny, Dona Guisa. She's known for being, first of all, speaking bad Portuguese, but secondly, she's views the world through pop psychology and sociological terms and economic sort of theories and things like that. So that her character though is very funny. But there's so many. I couldn't spend the time to go through all the characters here because there's just too many of them. It's like a Dickens novel, like I said, with the number of characters that support this story in such a fun and moving way, actually. So I will leave the chat there. Dona Flor and Her Two Husbands by Jorge Amado. My next chat is going to be, let me just pull up the cover. I read this one. This one's electronic, Homo Irrealis, by a collection of essays by André Aciman. I've already finished this collection of essays, so I should have a chat on it coming up fairly soon. Until next time, take care.